Good morning, everyone. My name's Kevin Watkins. I'm director here at ODI. I think none of you need introduction to our guest this morning, Angus Deaton from Princeton University. Angus, it's a huge pleasure to have you here. For those of you who don't know of Angus and his work, which I suspect applies to nobody in this room, Angus won the Nobel Prize in 2015 for his work in three areas, which was estimating demand functions, work that he did with John Muhlbauer in Oxford in the 1980s, his work on consumption, and his work on the measurement of poverty and well-being in developing countries. More recently, and we're going to focus more on this morning, Angus has really, I think, in some sense, brought together many of your life's interests in this fantastic book, The Great Escape, which is a panoramic overview of global progress in health and well-being and the various linkages between income and consumption and health outcomes. So, Angus, huge welcome to you. Thank you for being here with us. We're all a bit down in the dumps in the UK at the moment for various reasons. So I want to start with some positive stories. So maybe, if you could just give us, because a lot of this is an extraordinarily positive story of human progress. So maybe if you could just start by talking us through some of that story.
Thanks very much, Kevin. It's terrific to be here. Kevin and I have corresponded over the years, but we never actually met, so it's the first for me too. And it's really nice to be here and talk to you all. I think it's a really good way to start, and it's the way, people always want to talk about the awful stuff that's going on right now, all the various crises in the world. And it's true that the world looks like a pretty bleak place right now. But whenever people want to talk about how bleak it is, I emphasize, you should go back 250 years and think about what it looked like then, or even what it looked like for your parents or for your grandparents. You don't have to go back 250 years. And put in the context of our problems now, the fact that we're so much better off. You might say the world is a mess today, but the world is also better today than it's ever been in the past. And both of those statements could be basically true at the same time. And in particular, in the book, I focus on two dimensions of that. One is the sort of material well-being dimension, which is just, if you like, that our incomes are much higher. We have more stuff than we used to have a long time ago. And also that our health, which may be much more fundamental than having stuff, is just much better. So that, children, we still have many children dying in the world who shouldn't be dying, but it used to be that an enormous fraction of kids, even in Britain, sort of died before their fifth birthday. When my father was born, I was born in Edinburgh. My father was born in a mining village in Yorkshire. It used to be a mining village. It's not a mining village anymore. When my father was born in the mining village in Yorkshire in 1918, the mortality rate in England as a whole, and it must have been worse in Thurcroft, was higher than the median mortality rate in sub-Saharan Africa today, for instance. And that's not so long ago. My father died 7 years ago. He would have been around 98 now. So there are people alive now who, when they were born, the infant child mortality rates were comparable to sub-Saharan Africa. So that's just a huge step in a very short period of time. And now we just don't expect babies to die at all. A few of them do, but it's a really, really tiny number. Even when I was born in Edinburgh, the life expectancy in Edinburgh, which has never been great, all those stories about fried Mars bars, that sort of thing, is true. Life expectancy in Edinburgh was about what it is in India today. And, I'm not a young man, but that wasn't that long ago. So, we made progress. And if you go back all the way to before the Industrial Revolution, in the middle of the 18th century, when life expectancy was in the 30s and 40s, there's just been this huge amount of progress. Now, that's not to say that, there have not been setbacks. There have been awful things happen, and many of the most awful things happened in the last 100 years. But nevertheless, there's this enormously strong drive for the world to be better, for people to make progress, to live longer, to be better off, not to see their children die. And, that has been absolutely extraordinary. And I think that's important for thinking through where we are now into the future, because you say, where does that come from? And ultimately, it's because people have this very, very deep desire to improve their lot, and to improve their children's lot as well. And we sort of know ever since the Enlightenment, for me the Enlightenment is the sort of key beginning of all this. We know that the power of human reason and empirical evidence and science is really capable of improving these things. And so I'm a great optimist in the long run, even though if you look at what's happening on a day-to-day basis, it's sometimes very hard to be optimistic. So the book is largely, most of the book is sort of paints that picture from sort of prehistoric times through to today in both income and wealth. And there's lots of things I don't talk about, like the huge increase in education that's happened worldwide over the last 30, 50 years. I mean, in India, you see little girls going to school in areas where none of their mothers can read and write, for instance. And that's just a huge change for the better. Democracy is much more widespread around the world today than it's ever been. And again, we see setbacks all the time. We tend to focus on the setbacks, but if you just do the counting, many, many more people have the chance to influence the way their countries work than has ever been true in the past. So it's just, if you count up all these things that make life worth living, they're all getting better in the long run, even if many of them are under threat in the short run.
Okay, so maybe let's turn to the other side of the story, and one which you highlight in the book, that and to take child survival as the illustrator, that something like, I think you give a figure of 15% of 0 to 4-year-olds die every year. That's overwhelmingly in low-income countries. And I guess one of the central tenets in the book is that what had previously been assumed to be this sort of very direct relationship between income growth and improvements in child survival, it's not necessarily because of what's happening on the incomes. The Preston curve stuff is only a partial explanation. So I guess the obvious question that arises out of that is that, why in a world in which knowledge is so transferable and the benefits of science are so transferable, and the importance of income is perhaps less significant than had previously been thought, do we still have this picture of so many child deaths and basic health problems in the poorest countries?
Right. So that's sort of the puzzle, and in some sense that's what I'm grappling with throughout the book. I mean, and a lot of the literature talks about the diseases or deaths of poverty as if it were just obvious that low income is a cause of those things. But to me, as I've thought about this over the last 20 or 30 years that I've been thinking about these things, I think actually policy is much more important than that account tends to give. I mean, there's actually things we can really do, or that people can really do to make things better. And so it's just not, I mean, this idea somehow that if we get economic growth, everything will look after itself is one of the corollaries of believing that it's all poverty. And, it's a very negative corollary in some sense. And if you look around the world, I think you'll see episodes which illustrate that that's really not true. China is one of the best examples, I think, because if you look at what happened before the reforms, we tend to focus in China on, not very much economic growth after the revolution and so on until the 1970s, and then they told people to go out and get rich, and boy did they get rich, and you get this incredible economic growth, and it took billions or close to 1 billion people out of poverty. That's the positive side of the story, but there's a sort of negative side too, which is up until 1975, there was a huge government focus on public health. There's a famous book called Away with All Pests, which talks about Mao's China in the time before the reforms and the enormous attention that was given to public health and local public health and so on. And if you look at that period, all through that period, infant and child mortality is falling like a stone. And then they said, okay, go get rich. So they all went and get rich, but they stopped looking after public health anymore. And you can see that for about 25 years after that, absolutely nothing happened to infant mortality. So, you know, if you want to tell the story that it's growth that drives down infant mortality, you know, China's the amazing counterexample because growth actually increased infant mortality. But of course, what's really going on here is that state capacity was switched away from doing something about children dying and moved its entire focus towards. And you know, China being the sort of place it is, when the government changes its attention from one thing to another, things really happen. Whereas in India, they declare they're going to do something, but nothing ever happened. And in fact, if you look at India, it's a milder version of the same story. You know, after the reforms, there's quite a lot more economic growth. But, you know, infant and child mortality rates have just steadily declined through that period. So to me, the key issue here is I think you get high economic growth when the state is focused towards doing that, and you get big improvements in health when the state is focused to do this. I don't think we can improve health through the market entirely by itself. This is something that we have to do at least in part collectively, and government plays a really important role in that. So I think that's the solution of this puzzle, that, you know, really, really poor countries have lousy government, and so it's not surprising that the people are poor and the people are sick, because, you know, that's where that comes from. But you can break that link, and it's in some sense a very hopeful analysis, because it says that policy can do something about this. Whether you can do that from outside as opposed to doing it internally is another question.
I mean, maybe just to go to a slightly more parochial question, that you know that you describe yourself as an optimist, and actually in many ways it's an incredibly optimistic book. And if you look back over, and this is the more parochial bit, the Millennium Development Goal period, and you know the first 15 years of this century, it has been a period of absolutely extraordinary progress on many of these basic indicators. I guess the challenge as you look ahead is that more and more of the sort of problems that you're concerned with, you know, whether it's child survival, access to basic water and sanitation, the deprivations are increasingly concentrated in countries affected by conflict, or they affect particularly marginalised groups, which are, you know, are more difficult to reach. And so the question is, looking ahead to the target date for the Sustainable Development Goals of 2030, and the ambition that's being set on, you know, no avoidable child death, etc., etc. How optimistic are you?
I'm not a fan of either the MDGs, the SDGs. I mean, I'm not sure this is just a good way to do things. You know, and if you deconstruct what you just said, I mean, the idea that war is bad for children, you know, I don't see why we have to filter that through the SDGs. I mean, you know, war is always going to be bad for children, no matter where it happens, or what our or our real commitments are to doing something about it. So I'm not sure I think about it that way, but I don't think there's any limit. I mean, one of the things that's interesting, I discovered this after I used to draw a graph for my students at Princeton, in which I showed the decline in infant mortality over time and whether it was converging or not. And after doing this for about 5 years, I realized I was telling them something different every year. And one of the things that's sort of interesting is if you draw that on a log scale, you get a completely different answer from me if you draw it on a level scale. And what's actually going on there is the big decreases in the level of infant and child mortality, of course, have happened in the poor countries. But the biggest proportional decreases have happened in places like Switzerland and so on. You know, the rich countries are still decreasing. So it's sort of one of, if it's like the last mile, you know, in the hare and the tortoise. If you say half and half and half and half and half, you can go on forever, even though you're never really catching up. So I think I think we can still make an enormous amount of progress. And even when you get down to rates like 6 per thousand or something, you can get them down to 3 per thousand, and we've got countries.
But the question I guess what I'm trying to get at is that, you know, the specific challenges, because as you say, a lot of this is about states and institutions,
Yeah.
but the states and institutions in the countries that account for a growing share of the last mile, you know, are not states and institutions that one would automatically associate with the sort of rates of progress we've had over the last 15 years. And so I guess the question is, you know, is there something distinctive and different about the type of challenge to be addressed over the next period to sustain progress?
Yeah, it may be. I'm not sure. I mean, I go back to what I think I'm not sure when I revised what I said, that, you know, war is bad for children, you know, so it may be that peacemaking is the crucial thing, rather than focusing on, you know, drugs or focusing on bed nets or whatever has been successful.
Okay, so I wanted to turn now to a very simple question that I know doesn't have a simple answer. That you've been involved in the commission that the World Bank set up on the measurement of poverty, and there's, you know, we've just had this quite protracted debate about the new poverty thresholds that have been set by the bank. You know, a lot of your life's work has been trying to address this question of how do we compare consumption across countries. So the very simple question with no simple answer is why is it so damn difficult?
It's a really good question. I think most of my life work has been concerned with cleaning up after the bank when they've sort of screwed up the way they measure the poverty line. It's interesting, right? Because this seems like it's a really straightforward thing. I mean, you set some number, you wander around the world, and you find out who's below that number, and you add them up. You know, how hard can that be? And I think there are two problems, or at least two big problems. And, you know, I'm going to send you all to sleep, so stop me when you think people are nodding off, right? You know, these sort of data issues are something that, you know, only their mothers can love, you know, and it's very hard to persuade people that they should pay any attention to these at all. But, you know, they are incredibly important because, you know, I may back away from the importance in a minute, but I do want to say, if you don't have measures of how well you're doing, then you really have no idea what you're talking about. So actually keeping track of these things is unbelievably important, and we ought to be devoting, I think, more resources than we are to actually figuring out whether things are actually working or not at the most basic level, just like counting. So what are the particular difficulties of poverty? If you want a global poverty measure, meaning you're using the same standard everywhere, then that's really hard, because you want a poverty line that means exactly the same thing in the Central African Republic as it does in Bangladesh. And now that we brought the whole world into these things, it has to mean the same thing in the United States or in Canberra or wherever you want to be. And that again sounds sort of simpler than it is, but it's really, really hard, because what you're trying to do is you have to convert between currencies. So that's you want to know what $2 a day means in the United States and what's the comparable thing in Bangladesh or in the Central African Republic. Well, I mean, you can go there and see what you can get for $2 a day. But what happens if you get there and you discover that in two different countries, people consume completely different goods? And so that's one of the problems. You go to Ethiopia and really poor people are eating teff all the time. There is no teff in the United States or in Bangladesh. So how do you make that comparison? Well, you sort of can't. And there are just a lot of shortcuts around that which make it really very hard. There's lots of things that are not comparable across countries. Like some countries provide a lot of healthcare and education for people, which is an important part of the consumption. Other countries get it through the market. And so if you're measuring those things, how do you allow for that? How do you allow for the fact that some countries are rather good at providing this stuff, and other countries spend a lot of money on it, but the healthcare workers and the school teachers don't show up for work? I mean, how is that built into these numbers? So there's been a lot of difficulty doing that, and it turns out you can make pretty good comparisons between countries that are nearby. So, you know, Eurostat does, these are called PPPs, which are the purchasing power parity exchange rates. Eurostat does this for France and Germany and Britain and so on, and that's not so hard because your consumption patterns are so similar. You can also go to Africa and you can do it between Sudan and Egypt, where they all eat perch out of the Nile, and that's an important part of the good. But what do you do about Nile perch when you get to Birmingham? Well, there are no Nile perch in Birmingham, and so there's just a lot of stuff like that gets really hard. And these comparisons over big distances, converting a dollar into Kenyan shillings gets to be really, really hard. And what has happened is, ever since the University of Pennsylvania started doing these things in the early 70s and 60s, late 60s, the numbers have tended to be a bit unstable. So every time they do a new round, you get a whole set of new PPPs, and then all the poverty numbers get messed up, and no one understands what they are. So there's this crystal clear clarity associated with $1 a day or $2 a day. But as soon as you try to explain to someone what it really is, then it becomes sort of impossible. And you could say, well, that's true of everything. The CPI or the RPI or whatever it's called here, is it CPI, price index? Sounds like a very simple concept. And of course, when you try to figure out how it's actually made, it's like getting in the cockpit of an airplane or something. It's just incredibly complicated. On the other hand, you can handle that because it's true enough to the concept. I think with these PPPs, that has been really hard. The other thing that's really hard is the data. These countries are running household surveys. The household surveys are measuring how much people spend, and so once again, you're trying to find the households that are spending less than $2 per capita per day in local currency, and those surveys are not comparable over time in many cases, especially in Africa, where they might do a survey for 3 months here, and then 5 years later they do another one in another 3 months of the year, and they're just not comparable at all. And then once again, you run up against this question that some include healthcare and some of them don't include healthcare and so on. So they're not invariant to whether the market or the government supplies these things, which is a very serious issue for poor people. And especially in Africa, but not just in Africa. I mean, in India, I spent a lot of my life working on the issue that the growth that you see in the national accounts simply does not show up in the household surveys. I mean, Kevin and I have talked about this over the years. So, the left tend to seize on the household survey and say globalization and neoliberalism has impoverished all Indians, right? Whereas the right ignore the household surveys and say, look, GDP shows that consumption's growing at 10% a year, whatever it is. There is no poverty left. And until you can reconcile those two things, which we haven't reconciled, that everybody's free to say whatever they want. And that is what you see in the Indian debate, with the left saying impoverishment through globalization and the right saying that poverty was abolished a long time ago. And, people like me who are trying to get in the middle of that are not well armed to do that. So the poor quality of the data and the difficulty of the PPPs. So to me, there's a real question as to whether we should back away from this, these counts. These $1 a day are now $2 a day counts. I mean, I just said at the beginning, it's very important to measure things. But if it's this hard and it's this weak, maybe we should be giving bigger focus to other targets that we can measure, like some of the health targets. I don't think they're the same things. I think it's a mistake to say that infant mortality is a good proxy for income. I just don't think that's true. But maybe we should just put less.
But is the central conclusion that you draw from all this that obviously measuring income deprivation in any country is important?
Yeah.
But the value added of trying to do that on a global basis is close
Perhaps, yeah.
Is maybe not worth doing.
I think that's right. I mean, the other thing is, domestically, you can have a domestic political debate about what these numbers mean, and that happens within India, for instance. The enormous amount of stuff in the newspapers, and the government, and in magazines and things, and the same in the U.S. and the same here. And that debate is just not happening at the global level. And people are using these $1-a-day numbers as crutches for their own arguments instead of, I believe that, we often think that politics is the enemy of good data, because we think politics corrupts data. But try doing data without politics, and it's just a disaster. And that's some of what we got at the global level, because there are no global politics at this level. There's no global government. There's no accountability on the people who produce the global data. And so it's always going to be of somewhat lower quality.
Okay. So I told you that was a simple question with no easy answer. Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you
I can do that to
confirming
any
stuff.
question. Ask me my name and I'll make it complicated.
Okay, well, try it on this one. So you wrote a really interesting piece in Project Syndicate recently, which builds on one of the themes in the book. I mean, in the Project Syndicate piece, you call it global cosmopolitanism.
Cosmopolitan prioritarianism. Makes it even worse. Yeah. Okay.
But it's the basic argument that that the focus on empathy and altruism in international development has deflected attention, if you like, from our own backyards, and that's had political and social consequences. And you give the example of the marginalisation of the middle downwards in the US,
Right.
and in a sense, it's very topical, I think, for this country, because if you look at the outcome of the Brexit discussion, there was a real sense that communities and people who are marginalised voted leave as a protest against their marginalisation rather than on the Europe issue. So maybe if you could just start off by summarising or recapping some of your thoughts on that you set out in the piece, and then we'll follow up.
Okay. So, I mean, one of the things, just to come to this cosmopolitan prioritarianism, I mean, I think a lot of us have bought into this. You probably haven't, because you don't know what I'm talking about. But
Yet.
the prioritarianism is a term that the philosopher Derek Parfit at Oxford had invented, but Tony Atkinson had thought of it long before, which is that when you're thinking about public policy, you should give priority to the poorer person over the richer person. Okay, and cosmopolitan was to suggest you should do that on a worldwide basis. So a lot of the reasons a lot of us are here and thinking about these issues is because you think the poorest people in the world are people in Africa or maybe people in South Asia, and those deserve an enormous amount of ethical and moral attention from those of us who do pretty well. So that's the idea. So what had attracted my attention to this was really A, whether that's right ethically, and B, whether it's true that the poorest people in the world are in those countries. And there's been some recent very disturbing work in the U.S. suggesting that about 3 million people a year in the U.S. are living on under $2 a day, which is the African, Asian, the global standard. And of course, there's been a lot of debate about whether these numbers are right or not. And when you get down to it, what you're really talking about here is housing. Because if you're doing a household survey in India and you're living in a village, housing is of negligible cost and really doesn't show up in the poverty numbers at all. But if you're trying to make ends meet in Milwaukee or in Chicago, you might be spending 80% of your budget on housing. And you're being evicted on a daily, there's just really, really bad things happening, and horrible stories of people, having to prostitute themselves or put their children in danger in order to find a place to live. So, and these are things that the $1 a day or $2 a day is just not going to capture. But so there's been a lot of work suggesting there are people in the U.S. who are in enormous distress, and they're not all African Americans living in the Mississippi Delta. These are people at the bottom of the labor market who are not getting jobs in Milwaukee or Chicago or Minnesota and so on. So part of what I was just raising is maybe the poorest people are not there, they're here. They're on the other side of the tracks instead of on the other side of the ocean in some sense. And then it fed into the stuff that Kevin was just talking about, which is there's a large feeling in the U.S. as here that, the elites have walked away from a very large fraction of the population who have not benefited from globalization or from economic growth or for automation or from the banks or whatever you like to think about it. So you've got this very rapidly expanding income inequality. So there are a few people And I think of myself as one of those. I mean, given where I grew up and where I am now, I mean, I'm a, poster child for the benefits of globalization. But there's a lot of people that have just not seen any benefit from this at all and actually see threats. And those people in the US have been voting for Donald Trump, and in Britain they've been voting for Brexit. And you may not agree with their solutions, and I certainly don't think Mr. Trump is a solution to anything. But you have to recognize that they have a legitimate point, that their interests are not being well represented. I don't know as much about here, but they're in the US, that white working class that used to be represented by unions and the Democratic Party, the Democratic Party is now funded by the banks, the same as the Republican Party is, and there are no unions anymore. So, those people just they're not fully participating in democracy. I mean, recently a couple of people, both Larry Summers and Joe Stiglitz, I saw going on about this, that, when people negotiate trade pacts, every corporation in the world has its lawyers there around the table, and there's no unions there, there's no public interest people there, so why is that happening? And so these people just feel that they're not participating anymore, they're not being left behind, and when they get a chance to bite back, which in the US, presidential elections are not as controlled by money as the Congress is, for example. So presidential elections are places where you can bite back, and of course a referendum is a great place to bite back too. So I think that's a lot of what's happening.
And could you, this is related, or potentially related, to one of the issues that you've been working on with Anne Case recently, on this interruption of the long-term increase in life expectancy across the board in the United States, and some of the sort of health issues for middle-aged Americans that you've been working on.
Yeah, we don't really know that it's connected because we don't really know the causality, but there's this very disturbing thing which some of you may not know about, that we'd found that if for white Americans, not for blacks who are doing pretty well, and nor for Hispanics who are doing about the same as people in Britain are, if you look at the age group from 45 to 54, so midlife people, then in almost all European countries, the mortality rate, the all-cause mortality rate, has been falling at about 2% a year. Improvements in heart disease, people quitting smoking, better statins, antihypertensives, all the usual things that are making life better. And then since 1998 in the US, we discovered in our work that you just look at these graphs and you see them all coming down together, and then all of a sudden whites in the US start going off in the other direction. And for a long time we couldn't believe we hadn't made a mistake, because we're scouring all the CDC documents, Centers for Disease Control documents, and no one had mentioned this at all. And we wrote this up and submitted it to the 2 leading medical journals, both of which rejected it immediately. One of them because I think they never looked at it, and they've been very apologetic. So, just so you can see, sometimes for those of you who write papers and get rejected all the time, it sometimes happens to really important papers. And then the other one who did this thing, which I think of as something deeply wrong with economics and medicine, which is they said, you're obsessed with these numbers, but you don't know what's causing them. And if you don't know what's causing them, they're of no interest to us. That's like calling the fire brigade and saying, my house is on fire. And the guy says, what caused the fire, sir? And you say, I don't know, please send the engine. They say, we can't send the engine until we know why your house is on fire. So it got published eventually, and the world came to an end. I mean, it was just, I've never written a paper like that. Obama had us into the Oval Office and took us one in each hand and said, we're going to talk about this paper. And he'd read it and underlined the footnotes, and just amazing. So it's sort of every academic's dream that you get to talk to the President of the United States about your paper. So what Kevin said is right. It's potentially at least tied up to these other phenomena we're talking about. So this all-cause mortality is rising among white midlife Americans, much more strongly among working class whites, defined in this case as people who have graduated from high school but don't have a BA. So they're sort of never went to college or got a BA. You can see it not just in midlife but everywhere else. It's just not enough to overcome the positive forces. So it's only in this midlife thing where it's actually rising. All-cause mortality is rising, but you see it everywhere else. And when we first saw it, we thought it had to be heart disease decline was slowing down, one of the big things. But it turned out what it was just blew us away because it's poisonings. And yeah, exactly. And when we saw this, we thought, poisonings, what's happening? Someone confused bread and rat poison or something, it just, but what it turns out is that it's overdoses, drug overdoses, which the CDC classifies as poisonings. And it turns out that most of these are prescription drug overdoses. They're legal painkillers that have been prescribed by doctors. And there was a huge explosion by the pharmaceutical companies in the late 90s of what are essentially legalized heroin, drugs like OxyContin. I don't know what it's called here, but Percocet is another one that's sort of similar. So these are very, very effective opioid-based painkillers that are very addictive, and people get addicted to them, and then they try to kick them, and then they relapse, go back to the original dose, and the body can't tolerate it anymore, and they die. Or more and more, the doctors are trying to stop prescribing, put the genie back in the bottle, and people are turning to heroin, which is now incredibly cheap. So you get people in this room, educated professional people. You meet, respectable grandmothers who are addicted to heroin. It's entirely a white epidemic. It's not affecting blacks, it's not affecting Hispanics. Completely different from, drug explosions in the US in the past. And it's sort of amazing. Even Republican politicians are now talking about doing something about this because they're losing friends too. There are people dying in the streets in Princeton, New Jersey, which is one of the richest towns in America. And this thing has killed more people than HIV/AIDS killed in America. These are people who would otherwise be alive and are now dead. And you don't have it here, which you want to be very grateful of, and other European countries don't either. And I think it's just because, you don't let the pharmaceutical companies do here what they're allowed to do
Yeah.
in America.
Okay. The last area I wanted to cover before we throw it open for discussion is on aid.
Okay.
Which is the last chapter of the book. And I think you've got an audience that will cover the full spectrum. So, you have people who don't think aid's a good thing, people who are agnostic, and people at the other end. But you take quite a strong position on aid in the book, and it's really related, I guess, to the stance you have on the importance of institutions throughout the book. And your argument is that, that aid, in some sense, weakens the social contract between state and citizen, and that's reflected in a number of indicators, like the quality of governance, the tax to GDP ratios, and others. And I guess just to press you on it, that's an argument with intuitive appeal. Well, one can easily understand the politics that might take a government in that direction. But there are also questions which, to some degree, can be empirically tested, and a lot of the empirical testing work on those questions. And I know you can pick and choose whatever one you want, but there's work from Finn Tarp in Wider and Oliver Morrissey on those questions of the relationship between aid and the quality of governance, and aid and tax to GDP ratios and revenue, which basically shows either a very weak relationship or the counter of the case that you make. So I'd be interested just first of all on your sort of assessment of that counter evidence.
Okay. I don't believe any of it. Is
okay.
that enough?
Yeah, you could elaborate a little bit if you were so inclined.
I'm not sure. I mean, one of the things that's certainly on my agenda is to write, explain why I believe that, of those studies. So I actually think the evidence is pretty strong. Well, let me put it this way. I think the evidence is ambivalent or negative, if you look at it right. And some of the more celebrated studies have, to me, elementary mistakes in them, which are not. None of that stuff has ever been published in a good journal. And so I do think there are real intellectual issues there. So I'll come back to that a bit. But, you know, one of the things I resist, and you know, as a young man, I would not have resisted this at all, which was I was sort of brought up to believe unless you can do it econometrically, you know, that's the only way you think about it. I really don't think that anymore, you know, because people say, what's the evidence? And by evidence, they mean preferably a randomized controlled trial, or if you don't have a randomized controlled trial, some really convincing econometric evidence. And, you know, there's just a ton of evidence out there, historical evidence from people who worked in the aid industry, you know, people dealing with humanitarian catastrophes, people dealing with governments all the time. And that seems to me is really important to evidence too. And, you know, you can see these themes and, you know, just persistently there all the time, that if you bring huge sums of money in from abroad, that is not going to do good things to the responsiveness of governments to their people. And so I'm not against aid, so that's very important. I mean,
Let's come on to that.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. It's just I would not do it in that way.
Okay, but that's what I wanted to get on to
Right.
next. You know, exactly what types of aid you're against, because, you know, you could argue that, you know, if you look at some of the really most extraordinary success stories on child survival, you know, access to water and sanitation, education over the last 15 to 20 years, and you know, you're thinking of countries like Ethiopia, Bangladesh, Nepal, Tanzania, Mozambique, even Kenya in some respects. Now, you know, these are all countries that wouldn't score high on the relationship between the state and the citizen, right. But are all relatively dependent on aid in those specific budgets, where huge numbers of lives have been saved, arguably as a result of that aid and the investments in community health work and vaccination, or the global funds, you know, which have, again, arguably saved, you know, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives. Yeah. So presumably you wouldn't be against that type of aid? Or?
I might be. Okay. So let me start from that point. I mean, if you take something like antiretrovirals, you know, there are hundreds of thousands of people who are alive today who would otherwise be dead, and that stuff was all funded by aid, or a very large amount of it was. And so you simply cannot argue against that. And, you know, there's huge ethical significance from saving lives. And that's the easy bit of the argument, you know. And if that was all that was going on, not only I, but I think everybody on the planet would be in favor of those things. You can also save lives in situations in which there are negative consequences of that. And they usually take the form, if I can go to sort of generality, that you worry about the fact that you're saving lives today at the price of costing lives sometime in the future. Right? So, you know, you and I talked a little bit before, but take an extreme case would be the Goma situation after the massacres in Rwanda. And then, you know, there was a huge humanitarian emergency in Goma after the Hutus fled into eastern DRC. And then it turned out that a very large share of the aid money was then being used to, well, some of it was being used for the humanitarian emergency, and perhaps 2/3 of it, depending on who you talk to, was being used to train up the murderers in order to reform and go back and finish the job that you've done. So, you know, that puts in a very acute form. You're saving some children and their mothers in expense for arming a bunch of genocidal people, you know. These things always, not always, but are very common in times of conflict, where, you know, the warlords who are fighting the war will basically hold their own people hostage to aid agencies in order to meet their own ends. So it will take the form of, yes, you can bring them food, but you got to bring us guns at the same time. So, you know, you have to decide what you're going to do about that. And I think in the Goma case, where it was at its most extreme, most aid agencies led by MSF sort of pulled out and refused to have anything more to do with it. And MSF has certainly a long track record of trying very hard to think through these ethical issues. But, you know, even when Kagame swept in to sweep out all these guys, there were still new aid agencies that were going in there to help. So there was no supply, no lack of supply of people who were prepared to take the other side of that moral dilemma. Now, when you're talking about the Global Fund saving people, you know, I think you have to then think about the mechanisms. And I've been talking to them and trying to think this through, because, you know, a lot of what the mechanism you might think of is, you know, if they're providing all this health care, which is saving lives, then the government that ought to be doing this is doing something else. And, you know, maybe these things will never get built. So if you look 10 or 15 years down the road, those clinics that should have been there and might have been there will not be there otherwise. And so you're undermining that. But, you know, that's, and most people, I think, would then say, let's save the lives now, because the future is so uncertain, and we're not training up a bunch of murderers. But, you know, you can construct every case along that issue, and where you're going to take that line depends on who you are. So if you're very strong on human rights, you would say, I'm sorry to lose the kids, but I'm not going to lose the kids because this guy is a mass murderer, and we're not going to perpetuate his regime. And I have a lot of sympathy. I think that's my natural position, but on the other hand, you know, you have to be sort of consequentialist about this too and argue through that case. But you haven't asked me about the things I would do, which is, you know, there's a lot of stuff you can do without going near the country at all, which could be extremely beneficial, like our trade policy. I mean, we do a lot of things at home which are hurting these people. The countries that are giving the most aid are also the ones that are supplying the most arms. You know, so, you know, the Swedes are great aid givers, but they're selling guns all over the world too. And, you know, the same is true of the Dutch, the same is true of the British, right? David Cameron's selling arms all over, but I guess he's going to give that up after tomorrow. Well, that's sort of a good thing. Maybe that's the benefit of Brexit. Maybe Theresa May's not so keen to sell guns as David Cameron was.
Well, let's put it this way. I doubt the British aerospace are sitting there quaking in their boots at the prospect
I'm sure they're not.
Of a change-up.
No, but that's what you're talking. It's a very odd thing, right? You say, why are they selling guns along with giving aid? And the answer is because you have two domestic constituencies, both of which, different domestic constituencies, both of which you want to do that. And the only people who don't figure in this are the people who are supposedly being helped in this. And there's something deeply wrong with that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just to give you an ODI institutional take on this, that, we have a lot of people who are working on on trade, and on exactly these issues, and I think it's totally right that, you know, you can't look at aid in isolation. I mean, you know, it's one part of the development toolkit. The reason I wanted to press you on it a bit was just because it's such a live issue in a sense here in the UK, and I'm just going to ask one more related question on it before throwing it open for discussion. That, you know, that if you know, we have a humanitarian policy group here in ODI, and they've built a very strong argument that, you know, what is wrong, you know, that we should be doing humanitarian aid. That's a really important function because it keeps people alive and so on. But the systems for delivering that aid are essentially cartelized. You know, the aid donors want to work through the big UN agencies, the big international NGOs, and they're not providing enough support to people on the ground, you know, in Aleppo or on the border of Turkey and Syria, which I guess relates more to a question of, you know, the modus operandi through which aid is delivered. So there's one set of questions about that I'd like your take on. And another is, you know, that Goma, you know, I doubt there's anybody in this room that would disagree with your take on Goma. But if you look at a lot of what happens under aid. You know, it's support for health ministries to build data systems, support for groups who are working on international transparency to hold governments to account. And at least in theory, it's trying to address the very problems that you described, the weak institutional problems. So I guess the question is that do you feel that the system is, in a sense, so flawed that it can't do anything but shoot itself in the foot, as it were, with respect to its own objectives in that area?
I probably do think that, but if I were running a place like ODI, I would certainly be pursuing these other things too, because I'm not certain enough about it to go to war on that behalf. I do not write in the book, and I never have argued against humanitarian aid as a matter of principle.
Yeah.
And I think it's extraordinarily difficult when people are, in extremis, and you can help, to refuse to help. That said, most of the worst possible cases are sort of Goma-like cases and have been humanitarian emergencies. And then people seem to lose all the pressure and urgency is such that all caution is thrown to the winds, and then really bad things can happen. So that's true. I think it's worth pursuing this idea that it's the delivery system that's wrong and we should prefer it. But, there's a long history of people in aid saying, it's nothing wrong with aid, it just has to be done smarter, it has to be done better or something. And those arguments have not had a terrific track record. And I wanted to talk about the last bit, but I forgot what it was. What's the last bit?
You said you wanted to say something about the things that we can do.
Yeah. But there was something more specific than that.
Well, we're going to have half an hour of questions, so you'll have the
probably come back to it. But I mean, that's what I tell my students in Princeton, because the most popular undergraduate course at Princeton is taught by Peter Singer, and it's on practical ethics. And he has this very naive view that, you can go straight from ethical compulsion to you must then go and help. And the idea to him that, by giving money you could possibly do any harm is something he refuses to even consider. So when these students come to me and say, we just listened to you and we're sort of semi-convinced, what should we do? And I say, well, you should go to Washington, or you should go to London, or you should go to Paris, or wherever you come from. And that's where the argument, where you have standing to make the argument. Oh, I know what the point was. I just want to say this very briefly. I mean, the two places I know best are South Africa and India. And in both of those cases, once local NGOs start taking money from abroad, bad things happen to those local NGOs. And, they're not the same as they were before. So, especially in South Africa, there were a lot of very good, HIV NGOs. And then when they got taken over from abroad, they stopped being responsive. So there's this sort of NGO version of the state institution thing. And then one of the people I admire most in the world is my friend Jean Drez in India, who I've worked with for many years. And, he will not take any money from abroad. And he claims he even gets some flack from writing papers with me, because I'm at a neoliberal university and, in neoliberal land. And his legitimacy and his ability to do stuff depends on the people he's working with, the activists he's working with, believing that he's not a creature of any of these outside powers. And his ability to, bring people together and do the amazing things he's been successful at doing depend on him having given up his Belgian citizenship, become an Indian citizen, being a poor person along with other people and so on. And, so that's the other thing I tell my kids they can do if they want. I say that's the other way, like the camel through the eye of the needle sort of idea, which is, go to Rwanda, marry a coffee farmer, get involved in local politics there, and and devote your life to the people you say you want to devote your life to. And I say, well, that'll work too. But there's like, wait a minute, I just want to do this for 3 months before I go to Wall Street or something. I said, well, buy a tourist truck.
Okay, Angus, that was great. Thank you so much for that. So what I want to do now is throw open to questions. I'll take them in groups of 3 or 4. If you could keep them relatively brief, because I want to get as many in as we can. So